There is a moment in the history of the Second World War that almost nobody knew about for nearly 30 years after it happened. It did not take place on a beach in Normandy or in the skies over Britain or in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. It took place in a series of wooden huts in the English countryside, in a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, where a group of mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle enthusiasts, and at least one person who would go on to be considered the father of modern computing sat down every day and did something that the most powerful military machine in the history of the world had declared to be mathematically impossible. They read Germany's mail. Not metaphorically. Literally. Every encoded message that the German military sent over the airwaves, every U-boat position report, every troop movement order, every Luftwaffe sortie plan, every logistical instruction from the high command to its forces in the field was potentially readable by the people working in those huts. Not immediately. Not easily. Not without an extraordinary expenditure of human intelligence and mechanical ingenuity that pushed the boundaries of what machines and minds could do together. But readable. And the fact that it was readable, while the Germans remained absolutely convinced that it was not, may have shortened the Second World War by as much as 2 years and saved millions of lives. The Germans never found out. Not during the war. And the British kept the secret so completely for so long that the full story did not emerge into public knowledge until 1974, nearly 3 decades after the war ended. The people who had worked at Bletchley Park had signed the Official Secrets Act and kept their silence with a discipline that is almost incomprehensible in an age of social media and instant disclosure. They went home after the war, resumed their civilian lives, and said nothing. Some of them died without ever telling their families what they had done. They had helped win the most destructive war in human history, and they carried that knowledge to their graves in silence. This is the story of the Enigma machine. And it begins not in Britain but in Germany, not in wartime but in peacetime, and not in a military laboratory but in a commercial patent office. Arthur Skerbius was a German electrical engineer with an entrepreneurial instinct and a genuine genius for applied cryptography. In 1918, as the First World War was ending and the world was trying to figure out what came next, Skerbius filed a patent for a mechanical cipher device that he believed would revolutionize secure communication for businesses, banks, and governments. He called it Enigma, from the Greek word for riddle. He imagined it being used by commercial enterprises that needed to communicate sensitive information securely over telegraph lines. He tried to sell it to the German Navy and the Foreign Office in the early 1920s and was rejected by both. The military was not interested. The commercial market proved equally indifferent. Skerbius died in 1929, killed in a horse carriage accident, having made almost no money from his invention and with no idea that it was about to become one of the most consequential pieces of technology in the history of warfare. The German military's attitude toward Enigma changed in the late 1920s as the strategic realities of Germany's position in Europe began to sharpen into focus. Military commanders studying the lessons of the First World War had concluded that communication security had been a catastrophic vulnerability. The Allies had read significant amounts of German military traffic during the war, with consequences that had contributed to German defeats. The new leadership of the Reichswehr, the German military of the Weimar Republic, began looking seriously at mechanical encryption as a solution to that vulnerability. They found Skerbius's Enigma, improved it substantially, and by the early 1930s had adopted a military version of the machine as the standard encryption system for German armed forces communications. To understand why the Germans were so confident in Enigma's security, you need to understand how it worked. And to understand how it worked, you need to abandon any intuition you might have about how codes and ciphers operate, because Enigma was not a code in the conventional sense. It was something considerably more sophisticated and considerably more difficult to break. A conventional substitution cipher replaces each letter of a message with a different letter according to a fixed rule. A becomes D, B becomes F, and so on. This kind of cipher has been broken by cryptanalysts since the Middle Ages using a technique called frequency analysis, which exploits the fact that in any language certain letters appear more frequently than others. In English, E is the most common letter. If you look at an in-cipher message and find that the letter Q appears most frequently, you can make a reasonable initial guess that Q represents E and start working from there. Given enough ciphertext, a skilled analyst can crack a simple substitution cipher in hours. Enigma defeated frequency analysis completely. It did this through a mechanism of extraordinary elegance. The machine consisted of a keyboard connected to a series of rotating wheels called rotors, typically 3 rotors in the standard military configuration with additional complexity added by a plug board at the front of the machine. When an operator pressed a key on the keyboard, an electrical signal passed through the plug board, then through all 3 rotors, then bounced back from a reflector at the end and passed through the rotors again in the opposite direction before lighting up a lamp on the lamp board that showed the enciphered letter. The critical feature that made Enigma so formidable was that the rotors advanced with each key press, like the odometer of a car, changing the electrical pathway through the machine with every single letter typed. This meant that if an operator typed the letter A twice in succession, the machine would produce 2 completely different enciphered letters. There was no fixed relationship between a plaintext letter and its ciphertext equivalent that persisted across the message. Every single key press produced a different substitution, governed by the current positions of the 3 rotors and the plugboard settings.
The number of possible configurations of a standard 3-rotor Enigma machine with plugboard was approximately 158 quintillion. Written out, that number looks like this: 158 quintillion 962 quadrillion 555 trillion 217 billion 826 million 360,000. The Germans calculated this number. They were proud of it. They pointed to it as mathematical proof that Enigma was unbreakable. Even if an enemy cryptanalyst knew exactly how the machine worked mechanically, which the Germans assumed they did not, the sheer number of possible settings made a brute force search through all configurations completely impossible for any human team working by hand. The daily settings were changed every day at midnight, which meant that even if an analyst somehow cracked one day's settings, the next day began with a completely fresh configuration drawn from that astronomical pool of possibilities. The Germans were not wrong about the mathematics. The number was real. The impossibility of brute force search was real. What they had not accounted for was the possibility that their enemies might find a way to exploit not the mathematics of the machine but the human beings operating it. That the vulnerability of Enigma was not in its rotors or its reflector or its plugboard but in the habits, the laziness, the predictability, and the occasional catastrophic carelessness of the men who used it every day under the pressure and exhaustion of wartime conditions. And they had not accounted for the possibility that somewhere in Europe, years before the war began, a group of young mathematicians had already been staring at the problem and finding, in the margins of the impossibility, the first hairline crack. The story of how Enigma was first broken does not begin in Britain. It begins in Poland. And it begins earlier than most people realize, in the years before the Second World War had started, when the threat of German military aggression was still a gathering storm rather than a declared reality. The Poles broke Enigma first. And the fact that this is not the first thing most people learn when they hear the Enigma story is one of the more significant oversights in the popular history of the Second World War. The Polish Cipher Bureau had been working on German encrypted communications since the early 1920s. Poland's geographic position between Germany and the Soviet Union gave its military intelligence establishment a very particular and very urgent interest in the communication security of both its powerful neighbors. The Poles were not working on Enigma as an abstract intellectual puzzle. They were working on it because their national survival potentially depended on knowing what Germany was planning and when. That urgency produced a quality of focused, sustained cryptanalytic effort that the more comfortable and less immediately threatened powers of Western Europe had not yet matched. In 1932, the Polish Cipher Bureau hired a young mathematician named Marian Rejewski. He was 27 years old, recently returned from studying mathematics in Göttingen, Germany, and he possessed a combination of mathematical brilliance and analytical patience that would prove to be exactly what the Enigma problem required. Rejewski was given access to some commercial Enigma documentation, some intercepted German military traffic, and crucially, some material that French intelligence had obtained through a German spy inside the German cipher office, a man named Hans Thilo Schmidt who was selling his country's secrets for money and who provided documents that gave Rejewski critical insights into the military Enigma's configuration. What Rejewski did with these materials was mathematically extraordinary. Working largely alone, using a branch of mathematics called group theory that most of his contemporaries in the cryptanalytic community had never applied to cipher problems, he reconstructed the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors from the outside, deducing the machine's internal structure from the patterns in its output without ever having seen the machine itself. This was not luck. It was not intuition. It was a sustained feat of pure mathematical reasoning applied to a problem of almost overwhelming complexity, carried out by a young man in his late 20s working in a basement office in Warsaw with no computer and no guarantee that what he was attempting was even possible. By the mid-1930s, Rajewski and his colleagues Jerzy Rosiecki and Henryk Zygalski had not just broken Enigma. They had industrialized the breaking of it. They built mechanical devices they called bomby, the Polish word for bombs, that automated the search through possible Enigma settings by exploiting specific patterns in the German operating procedures. They developed sheets of perforated paper, called Zygalski sheets after their inventor, that could be overlaid to identify valid rotor settings. They were reading significant amounts of German military Enigma traffic on a regular basis. They had done the thing that the Germans considered mathematically impossible, and they had done it years before the war began. And then Germany complicated the problem. In 1938, the German military made two significant changes to the Enigma system that dramatically increased its complexity. They added 2 new rotors to the available set, increasing the number of possible rotor configurations substantially. And they increased the number of plugboard connections, further expanding the astronomical number of possible daily settings. The Polish bomby, designed around the earlier simpler configuration, could not handle the new complexity. Rajewski and his team found themselves locked out again, staring at a problem that had grown faster than their resources could keep pace with. The Polish Cipher Bureau was running out of time in more ways than one. By the summer of 1939, with German troops massing on Poland's borders and the political situation deteriorating by the week, the Bureau's leadership made a decision of extraordinary strategic generosity. In late July 1939, Polish intelligence invited British and French cryptanalysts to a meeting near Warsaw and handed them everything. The reconstructed Enigma machine, the bomby designs, the Zygalski sheets, the mathematical methods. 7 years of work. They gave it all away, to allies they hoped would use it to fight the war that was now clearly coming, knowing that they themselves might not survive to see the outcome. 6 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. Marian Rajewski fled east, eventually making his way to Britain where he spent the war working as a cryptanalyst, though inexplicably he was never brought into Bletchley Park and never told that the work he had started was being continued and expanded by the people working there. He did not learn the full story of what his gift to British intelligence had made possible until after the war. He died in 1980, recognized in Poland but still relatively unknown in the wider world, his contribution to Allied victory one of the most significant and most overlooked in the entire history of the conflict. The British inherited the Polish gift and brought it to Bletchley Park, the Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire that had been quietly acquired by the government code and cipher school before the war as a signals intelligence facility. What happened at Bletchley Park between 1939 and 1945 is one of the most remarkable stories of organized intellectual effort in the history of warfare. At its peak, the facility employed over 10,000 people, the vast majority of them women, working in shifts around the clock in a collection of wooden huts that had been thrown up around the main house with minimal concern for comfort or aesthetics. The huts were cold in winter and stifling in summer. The work was relentless, repetitive, and conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy that meant most of the workers had no idea what the person in the next hut was doing or why. Into this environment came Alan Turing. He was 27 years old when he arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, 2 days after Britain declared war on Germany. He was already one of the most original mathematical minds of his generation, the author of a theoretical paper published in 1936 that had laid the conceptual foundations for what would eventually become the modern computer. He was also socially awkward, intensely focused, indifferent to convention, and entirely unimpressed by authority. He was exactly the kind of person that a traditional military intelligence establishment would have found deeply uncomfortable to work with. He was exactly the kind of person that Bletchley Park needed. Turing's contribution to the Enigma problem was to take the conceptual foundation that Rajewski had built and transform it into something that could operate at the scale and speed that wartime intelligence demanded. The Polish bomby had been elegant but limited. Turing designed a new and considerably more powerful machine, also called the bomb, that approached the problem from a different angle. Rather than searching through possible Enigma settings mechanically, Turing's bomb exploited a fundamental logical vulnerability in the way Enigma worked. The machine, by its design, could never encipher a letter as itself. A could never become a. This constraint, which the machine's designers had considered irrelevant, turned out to be a crack that a sufficiently clever logical approach could widen into a door. Turing combined this insight with a technique called a crib, a known or guessed piece of plaintext that could be matched against intercepted ciphertext to dramatically narrow the search space for valid settings. The Germans, with the magnificent predictability of human beings operating under institutional pressure, helped enormously by using certain standard phrases so consistently that their appearance in messages could be anticipated. Weather reports began with the same formulaic phrasing. Messages ending in Heil Hitler were almost guaranteed to contain those words. Officers who were proud of their call signs used them in patterns that a careful analyst could learn to anticipate. The machine was theoretically unbreakable. The people operating it were endlessly, helpfully human. The first Turing bomb became operational in March 1940. It was not immediately successful. Turing's original design had a logical flaw that reduced its effectiveness, and for several months the machine struggled to deliver consistent results. A young mathematician named Gordon Welshman identified the flaw and proposed a modification, the diagonal board, that transformed the bomb's performance dramatically. By the end of 1940, with the Battle of Britain won and the war settling into its long middle phase, Bletchley Park was reading significant volumes of German Enigma traffic with a regularity and speed that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who understood the scale of the mathematical problem being solved every day in those wooden huts in the English countryside. The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was given the codename Ultra. And Ultra was about to change the course of the war in ways that the people producing it could only partially see from inside the huts where they worked. The intelligence produced at Bletchley Park was only useful if it could be acted upon. And acting upon it created a problem that the people running the Ultra operation understood with terrifying clarity from the very beginning. Every time British forces used intelligence derived from broken Enigma traffic to sink a U-boat, ambush a supply convoy, or anticipate a German air raid, they risked revealing to the Germans that their communications had been compromised. If the Germans suspected that Enigma had been broken, they would change the system. They might add rotors, change operating procedures, abandon the machine entirely. And the intelligence advantage that was costing thousands of hours of human effort every day to maintain would evaporate overnight. The management of Ultra was therefore not just a cryptanalytic problem. It was a psychological and strategic problem of almost unbearable complexity. Every piece of intelligence that came out of Bletchley Park had to be used in a way that could be plausibly attributed to a source other than broken Enigma. Before acting on Ultra intelligence, the British routinely arranged for a reconnaissance aircraft to fly over the relevant area so that if the Germans investigated why their convoy had been attacked, they would find a plausible conventional explanation. They invented fictional spy networks and fictional human intelligence sources to account for information that had actually come from Enigma decrypts. They sometimes chose not to act on intelligence at all, accepting military losses they could have prevented, because acting would have revealed too much about what they knew and how they knew it. The most painful example of this impossible calculation is the story of Coventry. In November 1940, Bletchley Park decrypted signals indicating that the Luftwaffe was planning a major bombing raid on a British city. The target was identified as Coventry. Winston Churchill, who had been briefed on Ultra and understood its value with absolute clarity, faced a choice that has no good answer. Evacuate Coventry and alert the Germans that their signals had been read. Or say nothing and let the raid happen. The raid happened. On the night of the 14th of November, 1940, 500 German bombers destroyed the center of Coventry, killed over 500 people, and reduced the city's medieval cathedral to a shell. Churchill had known it was coming. He had said nothing. The story of Churchill and Coventry has been disputed by historians. Some argue that the decrypt did not clearly identify Coventry as the specific target in time to act meaningfully. Others maintain that the decision was made consciously and deliberately. What is not disputed is that the logic of the situation made that kind of agonizing calculation a routine feature of how ultra-intelligence was managed throughout the war. The people at Bletchley Park were not just breaking codes. They were participating, often without knowing it, in decisions about who would live and who would die based on the strategic calculation of what the intelligence advantage was worth. The U-boat war in the Atlantic was where Ultra's impact was most direct and most measurable. Britain in the early years of the war was genuinely vulnerable to strangulation by the German submarine campaign. The Atlantic supply lines carrying food, fuel, and military equipment from North America were the lifeline of the British war effort, and the U-boats were cutting them with devastating efficiency. In the periods when Bletchley Park was successfully reading U-boat Enigma traffic, convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid submarine patrol lines, reducing losses dramatically. In the periods when the Germans upgraded their Enigma systems and Bletchley Park temporarily lost the ability to read U-boat traffic, losses spiked catastrophically. The Germans used a more complex version of Enigma for their U-boat fleet, the four-rotor naval Enigma, which presented Bletchley Park with a significantly harder problem than the standard three-rotor Army and Air Force traffic. For most of 1942, U-boat Enigma was effectively unreadable, and the losses in the Atlantic during that period came close to a level that might have forced Britain to negotiate. The breaking of the four-rotor naval Enigma in late 1942, achieved partly through mathematical work and partly through the physical capture of Enigma materials from sinking U-boats by boarding parties who risked their lives to grab codebooks before the submarines went under, turned the Battle of the Atlantic decisively in the Allies' favor. By 1943, the U-boat campaign had been broken. Not by better ships or better weapons alone, though those mattered. By intelligence. By the knowledge of where the submarines were, where they were going, and what orders they had been given. Thousands of Allied sailors who would have died in the North Atlantic lived because a group of mathematicians in wooden huts in Buckinghamshire were reading the orders that sent the submarines to hunt them. The North Africa campaign told a similar story. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was one of the most gifted tactical commanders of the war, and his Afrika Corps had pushed the British Eighth Army to the edge of catastrophic defeat by 1942. What Rommel did not know was that his supply situation, his fuel levels, his reinforcement schedules, his logistical vulnerabilities, were being read in London almost as readily as they were being read by his own staff officers. Ultra-intelligence allowed the British to target his supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean with a precision that Rommel found inexplicable and deeply frustrating. He repeatedly complained that the British seemed to know his plans before he had fully formed them. He attributed it to spies, to aerial reconnaissance, to the mysterious intuition of his opponents. He never suspected the truth. His communications were being read every day by people he would never meet, working in a building he had never heard of, using a machine his own military had told him was mathematically impossible to defeat. The deceptions that Ultra made possible extended beyond the management of individual battles. The greatest strategic deception of the entire war, Operation Bodyguard and its subsidiary Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the D-Day landings in Normandy were a feint and that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, was sustained and monitored in large part through Ultra. Bletchley Park could read the German assessments of the deception operation as it unfolded, allowing the British to see in real time whether the Germans were believing the false intelligence being fed to them through double agents and fictional army groups. They were. And the confirmation that they were believing it, visible through Ultra, allowed the Allies to maintain the deception long enough to matter, keeping German armored reserves away from Normandy for critical weeks after the landings while the Allied beachhead consolidated. Alan Turing did not spend the entire war at Bletchley Park. In late 1942, he was sent to the United States to advise the American Signals Intelligence Operation on the bomb technology and to work on other cryptanalytic problems. His reception in America was mixed. The Americans found him brilliant and deeply difficult. He found American bureaucracy maddening. He returned to Britain and spent the later years of the war working on speech encryption systems, trying to solve the problem of secure voice communication with the same mathematical creativity he had applied to Enigma. After the war, Turing's contribution to the Allied victory was classified. The existence of Ultra remained secret. He could not speak about what he had done. He returned to academic life and continued the mathematical and computational work that would eventually make him recognized as one of the founding figures of computer science. In 1952, he was prosecuted by the British government for homosexuality, which was then a criminal offense. He was convicted and subjected to chemical castration as an alternative to imprisonment. In 1954, he was found dead, a half-eaten apple beside him, in circumstances that were ruled a suicide, though questions have persisted ever since. The man who had arguably done more than any other individual to break Enigma, shorten the war, and save millions of lives was driven to his death by the government he had served in silence. He received no honor, no recognition, no acknowledgement of what he had done, because what he had done was still a secret. Britain did not formally apologize for its treatment of Turing until 2009. He received a royal pardon in 2013. His face appeared on the £50 note in 2021. These gestures arrived between 55 and 67 years after his death. They were offered to a man who was not there to receive them, by a government that had spent those intervening decades benefiting from a world his work had helped create. Idn't to ever discuss. The Enigma machine was never truly beaten by mathematics alone. It was beaten by the combination of mathematical brilliance, mechanical ingenuity, human error, institutional courage, and the willingness of thousands of people to dedicate years of their lives to a problem whose solution they were forbidden to ever discuss. The Germans built a machine they believed was perfect. They were right about the machine. They had not accounted for the people. Their own people, whose habits and laziness and predictability cracked the door. And the other people, in the wooden huts in the English countryside, who pushed it open. The lesson of Enigma is not that no code is unbreakable. The lesson is that no system built and operated by human beings is ever only as strong as its mathematics. It is always, ultimately, as strong as its people. And people, under pressure, in the cold, exhausted, following routine, taking shortcuts, typing Heil Hitler at the end of every message because that is what you do, are never as strong as the mathematics promises they will be. The Germans trusted the machine completely. That trust was their vulnerability. And it cost them everything.